Do you find it hard to love yourself on the days when you're not making progress, when you're confused, stuck, had a setback, or feeling tired of trying? Have you ever thought, what's wrong with me, just because you weren't healing fast enough? Do you think being hard on yourself, shaming, blaming, or being self-critical is how you reach your healing goals? Today, we're going to talk about why so many people think self-love is conditional, why practicing self-love unconditionally is actually a challenge for most people on their healing journey. And so this episode is for those of you who find it difficult to be loving toward yourself when you've made a mistake, when you're not healing the way you want to, when you feel overwhelmed and frustrated, when you want to give up. This is one of the most common experiences for people starting a self-love practice. They think that self-love must be perfect, or they think that self-love is only valid when you do something right, when you quote unquote prove yourself worthy of love. And conditional self-love is so normalized that most people believe being hard on themselves is acceptable, even laudable, to relate to themselves that way, because people defend fear as motivation. But that belief is conditioned and not at all natural to how your brain and your body and your soul operate. And so that's why progress is slow. That's why it's painful. That's why it's cyclical. You're using fear to heal fear when what you need to heal is love. But we're not taught that love is medicine. We're not taught that love can be unconditional, that love can be consistently safe. We're taught that love is dangerous, that it comes with terms and expectations, and it doesn't last. And that conditioning creates a belief that you don't deserve love unless you are perfect, unless you're worthy, unless you are enough, unless you are lovable to some standard. And that conditioned belief is why healing can feel intimidating and not easy and not joyful, because you're operating from conditioning that goes against your natural design, which is that we are made of love. We are sustained by love. We are surrounded by love. We exist because of love. And so when we're disconnected from those truths, that we're not only loved, but that we are always loved, then of course, your brain, your body, your nervous system, and soul cannot function optimally. They're running on false programming. And so that's the resistance. That's the inner conflict. That's the stress of striving for something that you already are. And that's why healing is difficult. Not because you're doing something wrong, not because you are broken, not because healing is innately difficult. It's because you are denying who you are. You're denying yourself. You're denying who you truly are when you withhold love from yourself. Welcome to The Simple Source, a paradigm-shifting space where self-love, healing, spirituality, and personal growth are redefined. If you've been told healing takes years, that abundance must be attracted, or that transformation requires struggle, you haven't been told the truth. I'm Linda Valines, a certified trauma-informed holistic coach, author, and spiritual guide. After healing myself from chronic conditions, complex trauma, and lack, not by following traditional frameworks, but by creating my own, I'm now teaching you to love, heal, and free yourself, mind, body, and soul, so you can reclaim your highest health, happiness, and potential with joy and ease. Each week, we go beyond surface-level self-help and into the real mechanics of transformation. If the traditional paths to healing and spirituality haven't produced the changes you want in the life you desire, you're in the right place. You were never meant to struggle or wait for what is already yours. Let's get started with today's episode. And that denial of love was something that I realized was preventing me on my own healing journey. So if you know a little bit about me, which maybe you do, maybe you don't, if this is redundant, just bear with me for a second. But I was chronically ill for a very long time. And in my early 30s, I began a healing journey, due to all sorts of various chronic conditions. And I saw all the doctors, I read all the things, I did all the things, I took all the supplements. For years, I did literally everything perfectly, but I never healed. And then my husband was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And then, of course, that forced me to re-examine my entire life, including how I was treating myself. And it made me examine why I wasn't healing, because I was faced ultimately with not only my health, but my husband's health, the health of our marriage, the health of our lives. When I asked myself how I was treating myself, I had to ask myself how I was treating him, because he had 2 years left. That was his prognosis. And I asked myself, what could I do? How could I love him the way that I wanted to love him, the way that he deserved to be loved in those final 2 years of his life? Because this was a man who loved me so unconditionally that I wanted to ask myself, what would that require of me to love him the same as unconditionally through one of the most difficult relational trials, which is cancer, impending death, and the pain of not being able to do anything about it because it wasn't my body. And so I realized that if I wanted to love him as fully as he loved me, as fully as I could, as fully as 2 years would allow, I had to love myself the same. And that's when I vowed, like literally vowed to myself to love myself unconditionally. And then that's when my entire healing journey changed. It stopped becoming like a daily grind, a daily hustle, a daily burden, a struggle, and became almost instantaneously joyful. Even when he was dying, even when we fought, even when we refused to say what we knew was true, which was that our time was running out. Even through all of that, because I chose to love myself unconditionally, day by day, choice by choice, moment by moment, it was joyful. To be able to show up for myself unconditionally allowed me to show up for him unconditionally. And that's how a few months before he passed, 90% of my symptoms and conditions reversed themselves on their own, what's called spontaneous remission or spontaneous healing, without medical assistance. Because in that unconditional love of myself, I realized I was really overstressing. I was allowing my healing to be a burden and a job. And so I just retracted all of the daily protocols that were really depleting, and I just chose to love. And that's the medicine of love. That's the power of love. It brought my mind and my body and my soul back into coherence without struggle. And that's what most people do not understand about healing. It must innately be simple. It must innately be joyful. It must innately be loving, because when it becomes a struggle, when it is a struggle, when it's rooted in fear, when you show up for yourself and you're healing from fear, it's going to be difficult by nature, because your mind and your body and your soul cannot heal optimally when you withhold love from yourself, when you are operating primarily from fear, because you're like stuck in survival mode. And the habituated relationship that people have to healing and to love is habituated. It's not natural, it's conditioned. And so let's talk about where that conditioning comes from and why it's difficult for you to love yourself when you feel lost, when you feel upset, when you feel overwhelmed and like you're not making progress, because it's nothing that's wrong with you. It's just something that you've learned, and it starts in childhood. So most people were raised in dysfunctional family dynamics. I mean, that's just truth. Where love was conditional, where love was withheld, where love was expressed through projections of the primary caregiver's unresolved traumas, expressed through the limitations of their emotional immaturity, and where safe, unconditional love was not consistent, where love was rewarded more than it was a relational baseline. And so you learned as a child that love was something that you had to earn, that you had to prove yourself for, that you had to be worthy of, that you had to be perfect for. And then that made love feel unsafe, because the type of love that you received was conditional. And that type of love is dysregulating to the nervous system. And so your nervous system is highly sensitive to stress. If you've listened to my podcast, you've heard me talk about this probably ad nauseum. But your nervous system doesn't distinguish between types of stress. All stress is stress. And so that conditional love is stressful, particularly as a child, because that's a basic need. As a child, we need healthy attunement to feel safe in love. And when we don't get it, it is like deeply distressful, mentally, emotionally, physically. And then when you're raised with caregivers who only provided conditional love, that becomes your conditioning for love. Like love is stressful. Because love was not given freely, it was not felt consistently, and you didn't receive it safely. And so that tension is felt not just mentally, but it's actually felt physically in your body first. That's why trauma lives in the body primarily, not in your mind. And so the more that love was conditional and the more that that was reinforced by your primary caregivers, then the more dangerous love became to you, the more disconnected you became from the truth that you are loved, that you were always loved, and therefore you never have to earn it. You never have to prove it. You never have to perform for love. And that dynamic is the result of, this is not to blame your primary caregivers, because that's just their own wounds, but it is the result of their projecting their wounds around conditional love onto you. Basically, their insecurities and their fears about love became yours. So, and that's basically the attachment theory. When you lack healthy attunement, you become insecure in love, because that's what early relational dynamics provide. They're meant to teach you. They're meant to hold you. They're meant to mirror love. And so how your early caregivers modeled, expressed, spoke about, and provided love shaped how you internalized love, either as inconsistent, unsafe, or conditional love, or as consistent, safe, unconditional love. And then that internalization is what wired your nervous system to either trust love or not. And then as you become an adolescent and you continue to witness basically your parents, your primary caregivers, treating themselves with conditional love, that internalization of conditional love, meaning love is unsafe, love is only a reward, love is something I have to earn, love is not consistent. You watch your primary caregivers treat themselves that way. And this is just most people, because we live in a normalized codependent society and culture that just gets reinforced. Like you didn't receive a moment where that conditioning was challenged. And so then, of course, it becomes your subconscious programming. And so from a neuroscientific perspective, when you have repeated adverse emotional experiences in childhood, like emotional traumas, they form implicit memory patterns that then drive your adult behavior without your conscious awareness, because it's all a part of your subconscious programming that was rooted in your experience of conditional or unconditional love. And so that's why you relate, perceive, and experience love the way that you do as an adult, including love for yourself. And so that conditioned belief that you don't deserve love unless you are perfect, unless you're worthy, unless you are enough or lovable, is not only reinforced by how your parents modeled self-love for themselves, but it's super reinforced by societal norms that are just basically personal and collective trauma narratives that go unchallenged, like normalized codependency, normalized struggle, normalized powerlessness, normalized conditionality, where you believe what you want comes with conditions. Like you can't have what you want freely. And that belief is also reinforced by the everything in life is hard mentality, which I talk about on this podcast. I just hear it all the time. It's the mindset built on collective beliefs that success is hard, healing is hard, love is hard, getting what you want is hard, this is hard, that is hard. I literally hear it every single day, and I just tune it out. I call it the everything in life is hard mentality, where everything in life is hard for you. You describe it that way. And then that creates the belief that nothing is worth having unless you have to work for it, unless it was hard to get it. And that collective trauma narrative literally saturates like everything, even spiritual teachings. And because it's the idea that you have to suffer in order to obtain joy, in order to be at peace, in order to feel loved, in order to be your highest self. And that's so deeply prevalent, literally in all facets of life, from childhood, through schooling, throughout pop culture, society, even spirituality, global systems. They all promote struggling. And then all of that just keeps your nervous system bracing for love because of your personal unresolved childhood traumas, or adverse experiences that programmed the belief that love is not easy, that has to be earned. And then that belief is then reinforced throughout literally every single aspect and phase of your life. That's why this issue is so common for people. That's why your ability to love yourself when things aren't perfect, or when you're feeling scared, or when you're confused, that's why you freeze. That's why you collapse. It's because love has never truly been reinforced as healthy. It requires an intentional restructuring of your relationship with love to separate you from that prevalent programming and conditioning. And then that also requires you to understand that the reason that that belief has been so reinforced and so unquestioned is also due to the fact that naturally your nervous system prefers safety. After a time, it doesn't really care if what is quote unquote safe is actually hurtful or helpful, because conditional love with conditions, is actually dysregulating. But if you only experience that over and over and over again, it becomes comfortable for your nervous system. It becomes familiar to your nervous system, which then deems it safe just because it's known, not because it's actually good for you. And so that also then reinforces the difficulty of loving yourself unconditionally. So now that you have an understanding of, hopefully, about why it's difficult to love yourself unconditionally, meaning all the time, even when you feel messy, even when you feel ugly and gross and incompetent, what it's rooted in and why it's been reinforced, like literally through every single aspect of your life, including your own nervous system. I'm just going to cover some ways that this shows up, because the more that you can identify, oh, this is a product, this is a symptom of learned conditional love, then you can identify those aspects of yourself as wounded, not to shame them, not to reject them, but just to have clarity about who and what you really are and what's actually happening in the moment. And that's going to help. So personally, conditional self-love shows up as being very self-critical, and you thinking self-criticism is you motivating yourself. It shows up as shame for needing rest, right? For slowing down, for wanting support. It feels like feeling like you're a failure if healing isn't as productive as you want it to be. It shows up as having a negative view of yourself, even if things are going well, even if the outcome looks positive. It shows up as a lack of confidence in yourself, which is also low self-esteem. It shows up as not being able to accept parts of yourself. It shows up as feeling unworthy, as feeling inadequate. It shows up as difficulty trusting yourself, difficulty trusting others. It shows up big time as that. Obviously, perfectionism, the need for external validation, for outside approval, numbing behaviors like substance abuse, addiction. That's also a telltale sign of conditional self-love. When you have difficulty with your emotions, when you identify with your emotions, when you judge your emotions, when you're unable to emotionally regulate, and that includes anxiety, that includes depression, not clinical depression. When you're hypervigilant, right? When you're super attuned to what can go wrong, that's a sign. When you're stuck in victimization, meaning you feel powerless, you feel helpless. Also, if you feel like you have to be in control for things to be cool, that's a telltale sign, and just like a prevalent feeling of loneliness and emptiness. And it also actually does show up in your body because, the mind and the body are not separate. And so if you have a tendency to get headaches, migraines, easily fatigued, trouble sleeping, if you're in any sort of chronic pain, if you have chronic digestive issues, those are all signs that your nervous system is dysregulated, chronically dysregulated, likely due to the fact that we're talking about this specific topic, that you are withholding love from yourself, that you don't feel safe being in love with others, but also being in love with yourself. And also if you tend to disassociate, that's another sign. And so relationally, conditional self-love shows up as basically when you're wounded inner child, when your wounds, your traumas steer your relationships, not your adult self. Shows up as people-pleasing, a lack of healthy boundaries, avoidant behavior. If you have a pattern of difficult or unhealthy relationships, like no matter if you go to therapy, no matter if you read some books, like you just keep experiencing the same dysfunctional relationship patterns and dynamics. If you're hyper independence, meaning you feel most safe being alone, and obviously codependency and enmeshment that's like number one. And fear of rejection in relationships, fear of abandonment in relationships, fear of being seen, fear of being vulnerable, and fear of intimacy. So that's all insecure attachment, what I just described. Basically not feeling secure in love with another because of that lack of healthy attunement in childhood. And that basically creates relational instability. That insecurity with love, in love, creates instability when you're in relationships. It creates like a constant push-pull because you want intimacy, but you're fucking really scared of it. And so it's unstable because of that. You want connection, you want love, but you don't trust it. You fear it. Okay, so now let's talk about why learning to give yourself love when it feels uncomfortable and even impossible is not only important, but foundational to your ability to heal authentically and productively. Because when you're being hard on yourself, what your mind and your body and your soul actually need is self-compassion and unconditional self-love, not self-criticism, not self-judgment, and certainly not self-shaming, which is all self-abandonment. First of all, what's most obvious is that when you're hard on yourself, when you withhold love from yourself, it doesn't feel good. You're essentially repeating patterns of self-abandonment that you've witnessed and learned as survival strategies. But self-abandonment is not a natural way to treat ourselves. That's why it doesn't feel good. And from a neuroscience and physiological perspective, self-criticism is interpreted as internalized threat. Studies show that when you're criticizing yourself, what you do is you activate your amygdala, your stress response, because you're essentially directing fear and shame and judgment on yourself. And again, your nervous system doesn't care about the origin of that fear, shame, and judgment, that stress. It cares about the feeling and the presence or lack of presence of felt safety. And so when you direct shame and judgment, resentment, anger, guilt toward yourself, of course it's going to activate more fear. It's going to activate that survival response. That's how you're designed. And that's also because what your feelings do. They're the loudest, your emotions are the loudest signals of safety or a lack of safety to your nervous system, because they warn your nervous system if something's wrong. They tell your nervous system if you're good. And so if you're constantly directing fear and shame and guilt and criticism and anger toward yourself, your nervous system feels that. It doesn't differentiate whether it's external or internal. And so then you perpetuate living in a state of dysregulated chronic stress, which then just naturally means that you're operating with abnormally high levels of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, primary stress hormone. And so when you do that, when you have constant high levels of cortisol, it does impair your memory and immune function, which is A, one of the reasons why healing is difficult. And B, it inhibits your ability to regulate your own emotions. And so it becomes a maladaptive feedback loop where you just reinforce feeling unsafe in yourself. And so you just have to think about the fact that nothing in life can grow optimally that way, including you, including your own healing, including your true authentic self. Fear is innately constrictive. It's also innately combative. It's a survival feeling. It's designed to prime you to behave as if you are under threat. And so that's why it's activating. That's why you become hypervigilant. That's why the anxiety kicks in. That's what it's designed to do. So when you're constantly living in that state, you can't ever downshift out of that and allow your system to actually relax, breathe, feel love, feel safe, and then heal and grow. Love, however, does the opposite. It is relaxing, right? It does feel good. It does literally clear mental fog because it turns off your stress response and allows your conscious mind to engage again. And that's why it feels safer, not just because it feels good, because you're literally functioning more optimally, from a neuroscientific perspective, from a biological perspective, from a physiological perspective, even on a spiritual level, you're functioning more optimally when you're operating from love. And so when you choose to be true to your highest truth, right? Which is that fear is not your truth. Love is. You're made of love. You're always surrounded by love. You're always loved. Then of course healing and growth are going to be far more easier and way less of a struggle because you're no longer in opposition with your true self. You cannot shame yourself into wholeness. I tried this. Boy, did I try this many, many, many years. Did not work. And I'm sure it hasn't worked for you either. It's not the nature of shame. Shame is the very thing that actually denies your wholeness, because shame says, I'm bad. Shame says, I'm broken. And so you can't actually use shame as a means to heal. Shame is the cause of the wound, right? It's not the cause of your liberation. And that's why you're stuck. That's why healing is unproductive. That's why you're stuck in cycles of progress followed by digression. It's because you're using your wound to heal. You're essentially trying to heal from your wounding, but you have to learn how to heal from healing. From a neuroscience perspective, neuroplasticity, which is how your brain literally changes and evolves, that can only happen optimally when your system feels safe, receptive, open, not when it feels like you're bad and you're broken and you're feeling constrictive because you're just directing fear and shame toward yourself. That's why love is healing. I mean, not just conceptually or philosophically. I mean, literally. Because when you're hard on yourself, when you allow fear to dictate how you see and you treat yourself, when you are essentially withholding love for yourself, you can't change. Your mind and your body cannot change in that state. That's not how you are designed. And that's why healing is difficult. That's why healing feels hard. And so the cost of not learning to love yourself unconditionally is just the cost of being stuck in the same conditionality where you don't feel whole as you are right now, where you do not feel free, where you do not feel like your true self. And then that means you'll always be at the mercy of your fears. You'll always be at the mercy of your traumas, not because that's your design, not because they have all this power over you, but because you're operating from that belief that love is a reward for you becoming regulated, right? It's the same belief of I'll be happy after I heal. It's that very belief that's keeping you from feeling love and safe right now. Love is the pillar for how your mind and your body and your soul establish and maintain regulation and coherence. It's not a concept. It's not a luxury. It's literally a necessity for healing. And that's why practicing conditional self-love also then fragments your own identity, okay? Because you are continuing to force your own mind, your own body and soul to operate in opposition to your own truth, because you're rejecting and you're withholding love from yourself. Even when you're doing it unconsciously because of your unresolved fears and traumas, what you're doing is you're creating a separation in you when in fact you are inherently whole. And that's another cause of inner turmoil, because you're operating from the belief that there are parts of you that are lovable and then there are parts of you that are not lovable. And that self-enforced separation is going to innately fracture your sense of self. I mean, that's what fragmentation is. That's why you don't feel whole as you are, even with your fears, even though you are whole right now, because over time, your wounded self became the primary identity, not your authentic self. I actually did a whole podcast episode about that. So if you should listen to it. It's a early episode. But your authentic self gets buried under layers of unresolved shame and pain and fear and unresolved trauma. And then the more that happens, the more that your authentic self is suppressed by your wounding, the more that you literally forfeit your life to your pain, to your wounding, to your fears, to your wounded self. That's why you forget who you are. So let's talk about how to love yourself, the logistics of it when it feels challenging, so that you can understand what that even looks like, what that even feels like. So here's the practical how-to portion of this episode. So the first thing, number one, there's a lot to this, but I'll try to compact to this so it's the big heavy hitters, the most impactful points. Number one is self-forgiveness. This is so key. This is one of the most fundamental ways to start loving yourself more now, is to forgive yourself. Because when you forgive yourself, you innately dissolve inner tension. You quiet that reflex to self-shame, to self-judge, to self-scrutinize and criticize. And most people resist self-forgiveness, or they misunderstand it because they think it needs to feel perfect, but it doesn't. You're probably going to have to do it. I'm not going to say you will have to forgive yourself over and over again. Unconditional self-love is not something that happens overnight. It's a literal practice, because you've been practicing conditional love for decades. So now you have to practice unconditional love. And there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean that it's ineffective. It doesn't mean that it's going to take a long time. It doesn't mean that it's going to be hard. It just means that this is how your brain works, through repetition. And so practicing self-forgiveness can be messy too. It doesn't always have to feel like 100%. But every time that you do that, you forgive yourself, you offer yourself forgiveness. You're telling yourself that you deserve peace, that you deserve freedom, that you deserve space to breathe, to be your true self right now, and that you don't need to be perfect to be lovable. And the more that you do that, the more that you pause to forgive yourself instead of shaming yourself, the easier it's going to be to love yourself more, because again, there's less inner conflict to contend with. And so that looks like if something comes up that you feel embarrassed by, that you feel regretful of, that makes you cringe, that you feel like you could have done better, you have to pause. Like, you have to pause. That's the first step. Breathe. Put your hand over your heart. You literally have to tell yourself that part of you that feels icky, that wants to recoil, that wants to shrink, you have to tell that part of you deserves peace and love too. Like, that's all that means. That's self-forgiveness. That's how simple it can be. And again, it doesn't need to be like 100%. I feel like I've forgiven all parts of myself, but that act of breathing, of self-contact in a loving way, of affirming your own lovability and deservability of peace does actually relax your nervous system. It doesn't necessarily downshift it completely, but you just need your nervous system to relax just a little bit in order for love to come in and to feel more safe. Also, patience. This is key. We all assume that we're living with this ticking clock, that we're running out of time. I did a whole episode about this, how that's an illusion. So you should listen to that guy too if you haven't yet. We're all conditioned to believe that there are consequences with time. And so that's the anxiety that kicks in, right? When you feel like, if I run out of time, if I don't do this in time, right? If I don't get this perfect in time, there's just that pressure. And all of those probabilities is what they are just imagined. You know, we hear this all the time. We can only exist in the present moment. The future is not yet lived. I mean, maybe in other dimensions, but we're not there. That's not what this conversation is about. But all of that anxiety is not actually rooted in the present moment. They're just probabilities that are surfacing because you're still conditioned to think and conceptualize your healing yourself through the lens of fear and unresolved trauma. The anxiety is actually not based in A, fact, B, presence, or C, attunement to what's real for you. It's fear disguised as desperation. It's your coping mechanism saying that you're not enough right now unless you achieve something, unless you provide something, unless you do something, unless you prove something. And so when you feel impatient and you do want to love yourself more instead of being hard on yourself, right, for not being further along, for not being more perfect, you have to start expanding your tolerance for pacing, for slowness, and to retrain yourself to return to the present moment through your breath. And so that you can remind yourself that this is actually where you are, like right here, right now. And the more that you do that, the more that you stop rushing yourself and allow yourself to be still in the moment with your breath, the future starts to dissolve. Like, it just doesn't really matter anymore, which is key because you can't rush your healing. You cannot rush yourself into the future. You cannot rush yourself into a perfect practice of unconditional self-love. What you can do is get better at breathing in the moment. That's feasible right now because that's something that is rooted and anchored in the now. And the more that you do that, like, you don't have to say, I need to be more patient, right? It's a byproduct of you just learning how to be still and slow with yourself in the present moment. Then innately you become more patient. And learning how to love yourself unconditionally when you feel messy means allowing yourself to be messy and also be lovable, which is really embracing imperfection as medicine. This has been a really key lesson for me in my life. I'm a recovering perfectionist. And it was very uncomfortable in the beginning to be like, this is imperfect. I'm just going to let it be imperfect. But it's just a deep medicine to allow yourself to be flawed because you are flawed. I mean, that's just the truth of it. And so you have to learn to love all those parts of yourself. Love the chaos, love the mess, love the confusion and the frustration. And you do that first by accepting your feelings instead of resisting them. You do that by accepting your whole self because you can't love what you reject. That's why I teach radical self-acceptance as the gateway to unconditional self-love in my book and in my program. You can't love a part of yourself that you deny, that you think is unlovable. Unconditional love is unconditional. It loves even in the mess, even in the heartbreak, even in the disappointment. And so when you learn, and it is a learning, because again, conditional love is not natural, it's taught, it's conditioned. So when you learn that the parts of yourself that you deem unlovable right now are actually lovable, you then have access to the feeling that they are already loved. Because unconditional love is actually the center of all creation. That's why there's benevolence and malevolence, right? Why there's shadow and light. Source is not going, I'm only creating this because it's kosher. It's like, it's unconditional creative love. And you're the same thing. And you can't really truly know yourself. And that's why Source creates, right? To know itself through all expressions, unconditionally, loving it unconditionally. And you're exactly the same. Like you can't know yourself unless you accept all of yourself. And then you can love yourself. And then you can feel, like literally feel that all of your parts are already loved. And then that's how you truly know yourself. That's how you reclaim your highest self and identity. Now your mess and your pain and your fear and your ugliness are divine. They're part of your wholeness. And so when you're in the midst of a shame spiral, when you're feeling overwhelmed, when you're feeling frustrated with your lack of progress, take a breath, again, take a breath to acknowledge how you're feeling without identifying with the emotion. And you have to tell, I'll get to this in a second, but then you have to tell the part of yourself that it's valid. Like you have to stop rejecting yourself in order to love yourself. And you don't do that mentally. You do that in practice by breathing, by identifying how am I feeling right now? Okay, this emotion is valid. This part of me is valid. And this emotion and this part of me, they all deserve love too. And then that also means you have to replace self-judgment with curiosity, because that's also the reflex that we're taught. We just live in a judgmental society. And so you have to recondition that reflex of judging yourself and replacing that judgment with curiosity. So instead of judging yourself, right, judging the emotion, judging the part of you, you're not enough, you're ugly, get very curious with self-compassion. So it's self-inquiry with self-compassion. You're not asking yourself questions to incriminate yourself. You're asking yourself questions to understand what part of you is resisting love, what part of you is afraid of love, what part of you feels unworthy of love. And then it's you asking yourself what that part needs to feel safe, to feel seen, to feel accepted, and to feel loved. That's the curiosity that heals you. Because curiosity will open you up. Judgment will constrict you. And you can't receive love from yourself if you're constricted. So that's why curiosity is so healing. And then it teaches you to begin to dialogue with yourself, which is so key. I mean, we can't practice self-love like intellectually, like as an amorphous concept. So you have to begin to like literally dialogue with yourself, like make it a conscious habit instead of unconsciously reverting to judgment. Because judgment says, I don't understand you, so I fear you. And because I don't understand you and because I fear you, you're not acceptable. You're not lovable. Where curiosity creates an opening for you to not only understand yourself so that you fear yourself less, but then you also know yourself more. And then that creates like a genuine foundation of you reclaiming your true identity. And the other thing, and I've said this, but learning to change your relationship with your emotions, because emotional health is key. I say this basically in every single episode to some degree. Whether or not you reject your emotions, whether or not you identify with your emotions, whether or not you are intimidated by your emotions, or whether or not you accept your emotions, like can name your emotions, can separate yourself from your emotions, That's the difference between keeping yourself dysregulated, allowing trauma negatives to dictate your own emotional state, where the fears become the louder voice than your authentic self, versus a state of not perfect regulation, but you're no longer in a survival state when you can understand the fear is not me, right? I can talk to my fear because I am not my fear. I can manage my fear. I can feel my shame without being consumed by it. And that's why emotional health is it's like fundamental. Without it, love does not feel safe, because love and fear are emotions. They're more than that, but fundamentally that's what they are. And so you have to give your nervous system the capacity to feel, like fully feel, in order to feel the fear so it can be released, and also fully feel what being loved unconditionally feels like. So when you allow yourself to name the emotion and then feel it so that you can release it, that nervous system dysregulation starts to relax. It starts to shift into parasympathetic, because the emotional energy has been moved productively. And that means that you're no longer stuck in a stress response, and then you can literally start to think and feel more clearly again. And so all of this means that you're just checking in with yourself regularly, basically, right? Unconditional self-love requires you to build a relationship with yourself. And that relationship with yourself has to be the most important relationship in your life. And that relationship must be loyal. It must be curious. It has to be mature, right? It's your adult self relating to your adult self. It's not your wounded child relating to your wounded child. So it has to be mature. It has to be compassionate. It has to be understanding, because you're not going to know what parts of you need love if you don't attune to yourself, if you're not relating to yourself. It's like expecting your partner to do something that you want them to do without actually telling them what you want them to do first. All relationships thrive with healthy communication, including your relationship with yourself. And when you start to establish that relationship with yourself, you start to make that relationship with yourself primary. You're going to need to learn how to pause, like I said before, breathe instead of automatically reacting, because conditional love assumes the worst. Conditional love reacts from threat, and it then will seek to validate the worst case scenario. It will then seek for the threat to be real. And when conditional love just becomes autopilot like that, you literally can't love yourself unconditionally. You're just stuck in autopilot. So when you start to build that relationship with yourself, you have to practice pausing with yourself in order to disrupt that patterned reaction, the autopilot of love is unsafe, I don't trust love, or I need love in an unhealthy way. Because that's all unconscious, autopilot, subconscious programming. And unconditional self-love is conscious love. It's you choosing to love yourself all the time, without cause, without end. And you don't get to make that choice to love yourself more, to relate to yourself in a more loving way, unless you become conscious. And you don't become conscious until you learn how to pause and breathe and ask yourself what choice you actually want to make in that moment. What choice is going to serve you instead of harm you or make you feel worse. And what's also important is that you have to set reasonable expectations. I think it's certainly a big part of why unconditional self-love can feel daunting for people, particularly at the start of their practice. It just feels like you have to get it right. And if you don't get it right, it's not worth it. And you freeze, essentially, you collapse. But unconditional self-love doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be unconditionally loving, whatever that means in the moment. And that is moment by moment, like what I described to you earlier when I made that choice and that vow to myself. I didn't just all of a sudden become the most unconditionally self-loving person in the world. It was something that happened literally moment by moment, choice by choice, day by day, month by month, year by year. Because it deepens. The more that you love yourself, it deepens. And that's not I don't say that to be intimidating, like it's going to take a long time, but I don't ever want to stop loving myself unconditionally. It's just habituated now. It's not something that I have to think about. It's just now how I just automatically relate to myself. But that did not happen overnight. And it didn't start as me being perfect at it. Definitely not. It's just what it was in the moment was what it was. That could be taking a nap. That could be hugging yourself. That could be screaming into a pillow. That could be crying until, you don't have any tears left. That could be putting on your favorite song. That could be taking a walk outside. That could be petting your dog. I mean, it could be whatever it is in the moment. You just have to let it be enough if it's loving. The notion of trying to be perfect, again, what I said before, you have to embrace like imperfection is medicine, because it is. And you have to also embrace the fact that you're already perfect. Like, this is the whole premise of my book about unconditional love. Like, you don't have to strive to be perfect. You are literally already perfect, because that is the definition of wholeness. And you're already whole right now. You don't need to strive to be something that you already are. And so I hope that this helps you understand how to get past self-criticism as self-motivation. I hope it helps you understand that being hard on yourself, withholding love from yourself, is actually self-harm. And you can't harm yourself and simultaneously heal yourself. And so everything that I describe, there's just ways to stop self-harming and to start self-validating, to start self-soothing, to start self-regulating. And all of that is self-loving. So here's your action step for the week. I want you to consider something that happened recently, something, an event, an instance where you were hard on yourself, where you maybe did judge yourself, shamed yourself, criticized yourself, and don't relive it. We're viewing this through the lens of an unconditional self-love practice. So I want you to pick a moment where you were hard on yourself. And I want you to think about what emotions you were feeling in that moment, the emotions that were present in you. There was probably more than one. You don't need to get this perfect. If you only come up with one emotion, great. Then identify what you needed in that moment to feel safe, to feel validated, that you didn't have, that you didn't feel like you got. And then I want you to grieve what you didn't receive then that you wanted in that moment. We don't grieve enough. Grieving says, A, I accept what happened. B, I allow myself to feel. C, I love myself to feel fully. And when you do that, you begin to demonstrate to yourself that you can meet yourself with gentleness instead of harshness, with emotional availability instead of emotional resistance. Because learning how to love yourself when it feels tough, when it feels overwhelming, when you feel unsure about yourself, is exactly how you love yourself unconditionally. It's how your love becomes healing. It's how you remember who and what you truly are. It's not by being perfect. It's just you embodying your wholeness. And you do that when you revere the fact that your imperfections do not detract from your innate perfection. And when you do that, you align with your true nature by default. And then, of course, you stop struggling because you're living from your wholeness. You're living in the truth that you are loved, that you are always loved, because you're seeing yourself as that and you're giving yourself that. And that's when healing becomes joyful. That's when healing becomes what it's meant to be. And that's when healing liberates you, because all of your parts have been reclaimed and remembered in love, that they have always been loved and will always be loved. Thank you so much for being here today. I hope this episode awakened you, inspired you, and reminded you of what's possible when you love, heal, and free yourself and reclaim your highest truth and power. If this show has transformed or enlightened your self-love, growth, and healing journey, please like, save, and share this episode, and leave a positive review on Apple or Spotify. And subscribe to be reminded of new episodes. Your support is deeply appreciated and truly helps this show so much. And if today's episode resonated with you, don't stop here. Go deeper. My book, Unconditional, You Are Perfect As You Are, expands on these teachings and gives you the missing framework about self-love that no one is talking about. So get your copy today to start reading and loving yourself more. And if you're ready for the ultimate healing journey with daily instruction and guidance from me, I'd love to see you inside the Source membership, the only holistic and comprehensive step-by-step self-healing program that is proven to work. Remember, you were never meant to struggle or wait for what is already yours. It's time to claim everything you want and more. All the links are in the show notes. I'll see you next time.